There is no God in the temple comes from Tagore's poem from 1900, which I know got well circulated during the time of Ayodhya, right, and the announcement of the temple as well. But it sort of talks about this abstractness of sacredness. How does one define the sacred for themselves? I think this work is very relevant for today. For me, it's been very relevant for a long time. I think the premise of the work, if I was to say when it started, I would say that it started because of me being born and living in Delhi to begin with. You know, I lived not too far away from here in Sheikh Sarai, surrounded by and in close proximity to so many different historical sites and ruins and forts, and we would go to Khirki village and take, you know, the underpasses and get into the village that once was used by, you know, emperors and kings or whoever. So I was always very interested in not necessarily in the study of history, not from the politics of it, not from the economic value of it, but to understand how people engage with it, right? So there are some people, you will see couples finding an isolated moment and a solace in a corner. That's an engagement with the history. There's a moment in which people are working with graffitis and iconoclasm. That's engagement with history. There's museums and collectors collecting objects in preservation of history as well. But then what about all the normal people who are not necessarily interested in the academic and the scholarship, but history is very much part of it, right? And I think people from Delhi, people from India have that without their thought, right? It's sort of, it's such a subconscious, it's given. And maybe the abundance of history is what causes the history to get marginalized as well. We like, it's in our backyard, so we treat it as if it's in your backyard, accessible whenever you want it, right? And then by the rest of the time it's discarded and ignored and marginalized otherwise. So I think that conversation of the engagement to a site, to the history, to an object, to the people, right? We talk about them from a value system, from a cultural system, but not ever really from a personal system of it. Like, if you go to a historic temple, the temple is alive. We celebrate the architecture, we celebrate the art surrounding it, but we don't enough talk about the engagement of the viewership, right? That we talk about darshan, but we don't talk about it purely from the perspective of the audience themselves. So that's something I'm very interested in. So when I first moved to Chicago, exactly 10 years ago this August, I was, of course, you know, part of the Art Institute, and if you've been to the Art Institute, you'll see that the Indian Galleries is the heart of the museum, right? And it's very fascinating to even understand why that would happen. Architecturally speaking, politically speaking, economically speaking, it's taking the most important capital in the world's third largest museum. So then you start to understand that there must be a patron who must have given so much money that it's now placed there, right? But then you also think about all these objects being exhibited, installed through a place which is basically a hallway, in a manner of speaking. And I would often find myself, like, you know, in the corner watching people interact with these objects. And because Indian iconography is sort of so abstract that often it is misunderstood or it is not understood at all, right? And I would often find myself just watching people see what is it that they look at, what is it that they interact. And I remember in very sort of naively in the first 10 days of me being there, I gave maybe about a half an hour talk about one of the Chola bronzes there to some people, and the most fascinated people were the guards. Actually, there were 3 guards who basically walked up to me and were listening. Simultaneously, just a few days after, it happened to be Ganesh Chaturthi, and I saw these 3 elderly old women who walked up to a statue of Ganesh, just wanted to acknowledge. I don't even think they were there to necessarily worship him or celebrate him, but they were instantly stopped by the guard saying, this, and this is what he said, "This is not your Ganesh, this is a sculpture, please stand away." Right? And since then, it's now been encased in an acrylic box. And I think this was a point of reflection, right? As what I was talking about, just growing up, was that this object, used to be, and this is the reason why they came to that specific idol as well, they identified, discovered, whatever, that it came from the temple that they used to worship when they were children. So this immediate translation, right, that transformation because of disposition, the transference that happens from an object being functional, celebrated, worshipped, idealized, to now being determined by a certain measurement and a certain medium, right? It's a complete inversion of what the object is supposed to be, and it continues to be for some and not the others, which in a way paralleled very differently to one of my visits with my students from SAIC to Sarnath, where, that main sculpture which used to be at the stupa is now at the Sarnath Museum, where about 100 Thai monks were there worshipping and perfectly allowed and perfectly acknowledged and celebrated. So, and in the context of the museum, in context of the collections, who gets to decide who gets to keep it, right? Who owns it, right? Like we often talk about the Elgin marbles in the British Museum. At the Art Institute is the Alstroff Gallery of Indian and Southeast Asian, right? It's celebrated by the patrons, by the people who were the collectors, not by the work itself, for example. So who gets to determine who owns it, right? What makes a tradition when these temples have been sort of looted and extracted out of the context? There is a change of a ownership. There's a change of a value system that comes with it. And we are all familiar with Subhash Kapoor's case, right? That who was criminalized just last week, in which he was identified to have stolen 2,208 sculptures between 2008 and 2012. UNESCO determined that about 50,000 objects were stolen between 1947 and 1997, roughly translating to about $6 billion worth of artifacts looting that happens on an annual basis from India. So that premise is where this work started. Previous to this, I had an exhibition called All We Are Breaking Our Stones, which is something that Mullah Omar, the head of Taliban, had said at the point of destroying the Bamiyan Buddhas, is that I'm not worried about iconoclasm, I'm not talking about the infidelity here, I'm talking about simply breaking the stones, right? So I think that conversion of something which is absolutely has no monetary value but has a spiritual and a social value, and then now suddenly is translated into a material, is sort of where work came from. So this is sort of the larger context of it. So there's a series of drawings, the gold leaves on the side there, which comes from a body of work called If in a Sacred Land a Traveler. So not only how do you define your own sacredness, but what do you do when you're traveling to a sacred place? Either it's a site, or it's an object, or it's a memory, whether personal or social otherwise. This is the title of the exhibition and the extract from the poem itself. And in this one, the process sort of is replicating also the tradition of mannat, right? When you sort of tie the knot. But I was wanting to sort of look into ways in which the gesture of the hand is visible but now completely absent as a ghost. It's almost like, if you go to the Sharjah Foundation, you see these calcified fossils of corals, right? Or you see the dinosaur bones that sort of calcified as well. So that transference where the object remains but is now ghost simultaneously as well. So this is porcelain, and I don't know if you can, I wish you could see it by holding it, you can't, but it's thinner than an eggshell, it's absolutely hollow, and it took me about a year and a half to 2 years of research in the chemistry of porcelain to get it to behave this certain way, in which it's not coming from a mold, but it's actually just one-off, right? Where the text has been burnt away, the thread is burnt away. It's almost like over the years, if you go to Sikri or if you go to Nizamuddin Dargah or any of the temples, where the cumulative dust over centuries has now become permanent, right? And the architecture become ephemeral. So in that same sense, when I was working on the drawings behind you, the drawings are done on gold leaf with soot, which reminded me in the graphicness, well, it's a horrible comparison, but the graphicness of the photographs from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where people had burnt away but their shadows became permanent, right? So that complete reversal of material in a similar way that happens from an ideal to becoming an artifact, in the same way where now the ephemeral is now more permanent and what was being permanent has now completely disappeared, right? So that's sort of what the premise of the work is. That's where sort of that materiality comes in as well. Like that piece of Chaucer, which is in that other piece you would have seen. So that's about a 10 foot by 10 foot. It's hand woven with each quadrant with colors symbolizing a country that had promised repatriation of those stolen objects. And there was an article at that time when Subhash Kapoor was arrested in New York Times called How to Steal Saints Out of India. So it was like a step-by-step instructions of how you could do that if you were to do it by yourself, right? So it was replicating his method as well. So, you know, he would hire goons who would go in the middle of the night, break the lock of the temple, steal the idol, super glue the lock so you're not surprised in the morning more immediately. And then, you know, he would ship it out to a workshop outside Chennai, make a mold, cast it in bronze, put a patina on it, get a certificate of handicraft, ship the original antiquity, but in the name of a handicraft, then fabricate the entire provenance of an object that would go into a private collection that would end up in a museum, for example. So the sculptures in there are the exact reproductions of the ones which were promised repatriation. Some of them have made it back to India, and some of them are in the National Museum now in Delhi that you can see, like the Buddha sculpture from Canberra, Australia is there, and there's a couple of others as well. But at that point of time, nobody had access to these images except photographs. So all of these were digitally recreated, fabricated just from black and white photographs. And for me, sort of, you know, Chaucer, like for us, right, has a direct reference to the ideas of cheat and deceit, to the shift of power, right, economic and political, which is replicated in the dice as well. So, you know, the person who holds the dice holds the power. And as you throw the dice, it changes the fate of an object. So sometimes it becomes mine, sometimes it becomes ours, sometimes it becomes missing. So sort of that randomness of the change of fate of a sculpture is what is part of that. I'm also very interested in that plasticity, right? So they're all 3D printed, like the Nandi is 3D printed, who's looking at the title rather than, right, and an object. And you know, for me, for example, these almost became replicas as souvenirs that you would find in museum shops. So that complete, instead of elevating the value that would happen with collections, it devalues because it's plastic, right? So sort of that devaluation is something I'm very interested as well. So, you know, because one doesn't have access to objects that you could 3D scan, right? And I think this is something which is reflective of my teaching at SAIC, you know, at the School of the Art and Interiors, because we have no majors, so we work across the discipline, and all these people are evidence of that as well. I just basically follow my students rather than they're following me. But I think, so the point is that how does one start to understand the ideas of replication and reproduction, right? For me, to make it into a same material or refabricate it as a fake was not interesting at all, right? I wanted to rather exaggerate and enhance the reproduction value of that, right? The fact that this has been, because of lack of engagement, because of lack of access, now what do you do with the system? Either you can create a fake out of it, and we were talking about it earlier a little bit as well, or you can romanticize and exaggerate and embrace that shift of a value system. Like it's almost in a way akin to the Japanese tradition of kintsugi, right, where the faults are beautified, highlighted, exaggerated even further. And if you go at the end of the gallery, that big wall, the case of broken hands, are reproductions of 40 sculptures from a black and white photograph from an archive in the National Museum from 1913, 1914, when they could not identify these fragments, the home of these fragments, the bodies that they belong to. And the title of that was The Case of Broken Hands. So not only, of course, one doesn't even know if these exist anymore. I haven't had a response from the National Museum yet. But the case of the broken hand itself is a double meaning in that, right? It's a case, but it's also a case of where they come from. So the point of them being refabricated, recreated, is something I wanted to really make it very obvious and very exaggerated. But then, of course, they had done it to the scale where it's not being interfered by the matrix as much as well. Like, so they are printed to as much detail or as much resolution as one could imagine. So they are all rendered as if they are sculpted on the computer, so to speak, right? So they are not scans of anything. So it took a lot of research also to understand what it looked like on the other side, beyond a black and white photograph. So I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
And the miniature thing.
I knew you would come to that.
In particular, the last one that actually has a reflection of the Radha.
Yeah.
It's the only one. It's kind of jarring.
Yeah. So I that was the shock value to me, and I think the reason why, I had purposefully, in fact, included that in the title and did that series, is to make a contradiction within my own work, that those are almost to the point of erasure, but without the evidence of an erasure, right? It's like, it's not thinking of Fred Wilson's intervention with the vellum to exaggerate the blackness of a figure, but rather to just leave a hint of that eerie sense that something is missing. And for us, for example, it's very obvious that the shrine is absolutely empty, but then the people continue their act, right? Whether with a replicated, reproduced replacement of the original, right? For example, like in many of these temples, when we are talking about repatriation, they are not going back to the people who had incurred the loss. So they continue to exist, right? With that loss and with that emotional stress and burden. But they are going into scholarship, they're going into museum, or God knows where they're going as well, right? It's not been fully acknowledged yet. So to leave something evidently empty while everything else continues, right? People's lives continue, the architecture continues, the temple continues, the worship continues, but there is that element which is like vanished, not erased, but basically, that altar is populated and then it's empty. There is no in between. It's binary, right? It's either there or not there. So that's why sort of the paintings are, to the detail and to the style, because they all come from different styles of miniatures as well, for them to be real but with that missing, as the temple is there in reality minus the element.